The fire didn't start with flames anyone could see. It began underground, quiet, suffocating, and almost invisible. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. In 1972, a small American town was evacuated in just 3 days. No war, no flood, no earthquake, just smoke, rising from the ground itself. And even now, decades later, that fire is still burning. But to understand why an entire town had to be erased from the map, you have to start with something much smaller. A single decision, a routine cleanup, and a mistake that would outlive everyone who made it. It was late May of 1972 in Centralia, Pennsylvania. The town wasn't large, just over 1,000 residents, but it had the kind of quiet permanence that made people believe it would always be there. Rows of modest homes, a few churches, a diner where everyone knew each other's names, and beneath it all, coal. For more than a century, Centralia had existed because of what was buried underground. Vast networks of coal mines stretched beneath the town like a second invisible city. Tunnels carved out over generations, some abandoned, some forgotten, many poorly documented. To the people above, it was just part of life. Until it wasn't. That Memorial Day, the town council arranged a routine cleanup of the local landfill. Trash had been piling up, and as was common practice at the time, the solution was simple. Burn it. A controlled fire, monitored, temporary. Or at least that was the plan. Firefighters arrived. The landfill was set ablaze. Smoke rose into the air. By all appearances, it was just another day. But something underneath the landfill, something hidden in the fractured ground, caught fire too. And no one noticed. Not at first. What happened next wasn't dramatic. There were no explosions, no sudden disasters. Just small, strange signs. A faint smell. A little more smoke than usual. Residents began to notice warm patches in their basements. Some reported a strange, almost metallic odor in the air. But these things didn't immediately signal danger. Not in a town built on coal. Not in a place where underground fires weren't entirely unheard of. But here's what matters. This wasn't a normal fire. It wasn't burning on the surface. It was burning inside the earth itself. And once it reached the coal seams beneath Centralia, it found something far more dangerous than trash. It found fuel. The fire had slipped into an abandoned mine shaft, one of many scattered beneath the town. These shafts were often poorly sealed, remnants of decades of mining operations that had long since ceased. Once the fire entered the mine, it began to spread. Slowly, silently, relentlessly. Coal, unlike wood or surface materials, doesn't burn out quickly underground. It smolders, it creeps. It consumes oxygen and releases gases that can travel through cracks and tunnels, igniting new sections as they go. It's not a fire you can simply put out. It's a fire that moves like a living system. And by the time officials realized what was happening, the fire was no longer confined. It was everywhere beneath them. The first serious attempts to stop it came quickly. Excavation crews were brought in. Trenches were dug. Water was pumped underground. Experts were consulted. But every effort ran into the same problem. No one fully understood the extent of the mine network below Centralia. Maps were incomplete. Tunnels had collapsed or shifted. Some passages had never been recorded at all. The fire wasn't just spreading. It was disappearing into places no one could reach. And every time they thought they had contained it, it reappeared somewhere else. A crack in the ground, a plume of smoke from a hillside, a patch of grass that suddenly turned yellow and died. The town was sitting on top of something that couldn't be mapped and couldn't be controlled. But the real danger wasn't the fire itself. It was what the fire was producing. As the coal burned, it released carbon monoxide, a colorless, odorless gas that can kill without warning. At first, the levels were low, detectable, but not immediately lethal. Then they began to rise. Homes started filling with gas. Residents reported headaches, dizziness, nausea. One family nearly died in their sleep before realizing what was happening. This wasn't just a fire anymore. It was an invisible threat, seeping into the very air people breathed. And still, many didn't want to leave. This was their home, their history, their identity. Centralia wasn't just a town. It was a community built over generations. Families had lived there for decades, some for over a century. To leave meant abandoning everything, so they stayed, at least for a while. Then something happened that changed everything. In 1981, nearly a decade after the fire began, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was playing in his backyard when the ground beneath him suddenly gave way. A sinkhole opened without warning. He fell through the earth into a void filled with heat and toxic gas. For a moment, he disappeared. His cousin managed to pull him out just in time. But what lay beneath that hole wasn't empty space. It was the fire, burning just feet below the surface, waiting. That incident did what years of warnings couldn't. It made the danger undeniable. This wasn't a slow, distant problem anymore. It was immediate. It was personal. And it could happen to anyone. But here's what they don't tell you. The fire wasn't just a natural accident gone wrong. Because by this point, the question wasn't whether the fire could be stopped. It was whether anyone had ever really tried to stop it properly. Over the years, multiple plans were proposed to extinguish the fire. Some involved massive excavation, removing entire sections of land to cut off the fire's path. Others suggested flooding the mines completely. But each plan came with a cost. Millions of dollars and no guarantee of success. In a small town like Centralia, the question quickly became less about possibility and more about priority. Was it worth saving? The real story begins when you follow the money. Because by the early 1980s, the federal government had stepped in. Studies were conducted, reports were filed, experts analyzed the situation, and the conclusion was clear. The fire could burn for decades, possibly centuries, and stopping it would require an enormous, uncertain investment. So a decision was made, not to fight the fire, but to move the people. In 1984, the U.S. government approved a relocation program. Residents were offered compensation to leave their homes. Many accepted, some refused, but the direction was set. Centralia would not be saved. It would be abandoned. Over the next few years, homes were demolished, streets were erased, buildings that once held generations of memories were reduced to empty lots. And slowly, the town began to disappear. Not because it was destroyed overnight, but because it was allowed to fade. Today, only a handful of residents remain. The rest of Centralia is gone. But the fire is still there, burning beneath the ground, unseen, unstoppable. And that raises a question most people never think to ask. If a fire like this can burn for decades beneath a town, what else could be happening beneath our feet that we don't see? And more importantly, what happens when the cost of stopping a disaster becomes greater than the value of saving the people above it? Because Centralia wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a decision. And decisions like that tend to repeat. At first glance, Centralia looks like a tragedy of circumstance, a small town, an unfortunate mistake, a fire that got out of control. But that version of the story is incomplete, because the moment officials realized the fire couldn't be easily extinguished, the situation stopped being purely environmental. It became economic. And once that shift happens, the outcome is rarely about what is possible. It's about what is chosen. By the early 1980s, multiple engineering assessments had already outlined potential solutions. Excavation could isolate the burning coal seams. Barrier trenches could slow or redirect the spread. Advanced sealing techniques could cut off oxygen flow. None of these were guaranteed, but none were impossible either. What they required was commitment and funding. A lot of it. But here's what matters. Centralia wasn't a major city. It wasn't economically critical. It didn't hold strategic value. It was, in the eyes of policymakers, a small, declining mining town with a shrinking population and limited future growth, which meant that the cost-benefit calculation was already tilted, not in favor of saving it, but in favor of letting it go. This wasn't just about a fire. It was about how systems decide what is worth preserving and what isn't. Relocation, from a policy standpoint, was efficient. Instead of spending tens or hundreds of millions on uncertain engineering solutions, the government could spend a fraction of that amount to buy out residents and relocate them. On paper, it made sense. Fewer variables, lower risk, faster resolution. But that framing hides something deeper, because it shifts the burden of the disaster away from the system that allowed it, and onto the people who lived above it. Families were given compensation, but compensation is not the same as restoration. You can pay someone for their house. You cannot pay them for their history. And yet, the narrative was controlled carefully. The evacuation was presented as necessary, practical, inevitable. There was little public discussion about alternative outcomes, little transparency about how decisions were weighed. Because once a system commits to a path, it rarely revisits the roads it chose not to take. But this pattern isn't unique to Centralia. It appears in different forms across history. Industrial disasters, environmental collapses, economic displacements. Again and again the same structure emerges. An event occurs, solutions are evaluated, costs are calculated, and ultimately a line is drawn between what can be saved and what will be sacrificed. In Centralia's case, that line ran directly through the town itself. But the deeper insight isn't just about the decision, it's about the timeline. Because underground coal fires are not rare. They exist in multiple parts of the world. Some have been burning for decades, others for centuries. And yet, very few receive the same level of attention or urgency. Why? Because most of them occur in places where intervention is either too costly or too inconvenient. This is where the story shifts from a single town to a broader system. Centralia reveals a fundamental truth about how modern systems handle long-term problems. If a crisis is immediate, visible, and politically urgent, it gets attention. If it is slow, hidden, and complex, it gets deferred. The fire beneath Centralia didn't explode overnight. It spread gradually, which meant that every stage of the crisis felt manageable, containable, delayable, until it wasn't. And by the time it reached a point where decisive action was required, the cost of that action had grown too large. Not just financially, but politically, logistically, structurally. So the system adapted, not by solving the problem, but by redefining it. The problem was no longer the fire. The problem was the people living above it. And once that reframing takes hold, the solution becomes obvious. Remove the people, leave the fire. But here's the unsettling part. That logic doesn't just apply to Centralia. It applies to any situation where a hidden, long-term risk intersects with human lives. Environmental degradation, infrastructure decay, resource depletion. When the cost of fixing the root problem exceeds the perceived value of the affected area, the solution often shifts toward relocation, abandonment, or containment. And that raises a difficult question, not about Centralia, but about everywhere else. What other invisible fires exist today? Not literal flames beneath the ground, but slow-burning problems beneath systems. Problems that are known, documented, understood, but not fully addressed. Because addressing them would require more than incremental effort. It would require transformation. Centralia forces us to confront the idea that some problems are not ignored because they are unknown. They are ignored because they are inconvenient. Even now, the fire continues to burn. Estimates suggest it could keep going for another 250 years, possibly longer. No one knows exactly, because no one is actively trying to stop it anymore. The town above it has been erased, but the cause remains, and that is the final layer of the story. Because Centralia is often remembered as a place that disappeared. But that's not entirely accurate. The town didn't disappear. It was removed, deliberately, systematically, as part of a decision. The fire didn't win. It was allowed to continue. And that distinction matters, because it reveals something fundamental about how we interpret events. We often describe outcomes as inevitable, as if they could not have been otherwise. But when you look closely, you begin to see the choices embedded within them. Centralia wasn't just the result of a fire. It was the result of how that fire was handled. And that leaves us with one final thought. Not about the past, but about the future. Somewhere, right now, there are problems that have already begun, small, hidden, barely noticeable. They don't look urgent. They don't demand immediate action. And because of that, they are easy to ignore. Until they aren't. Because the most dangerous fires are not the ones you can see. They are the ones that burn quietly, beneath everything.